Hello and welcome to Talkernate History, the podcast where we,
Matt,
and Max, talk about works of alternate history scenarios, and history in general. For tonight's episode, we're going to talk about the Harry Turtledove Trilogy, American Empire, which is the trilogy which is nested between the Great War Trilogy, which is about World War I, and the Settling Accounts Quadrilogy, which is about World War II. So this is the interwar years.
Yeah, this is really interesting. The American Empire series. There's a lot to cover, and it has a really interesting, different feel to it that I, in some ways, like. Is that How Few Remain and the Great War are by necessity mainly about war, but the American Empire series, and so is Settling Accounts, but American Empire is really the best chance that Harry Turtledove has to flesh out what civilian life is like.
Right.
So there's a lot to digest, a lot of good stuff. But
like when I first read this trilogy, I was a little worried because I thought, like, what are they going to do if they're not constantly fighting all the time? And actually, I think it does a pretty good job of remaining interesting, even though, you know, there's not people getting shot every other chapter.
Yeah, I think it captures well what happens to people afterwards. And I think generally it tends to follow the trend of history in our world. So the early 20s is a time of economic boom in the United States, the victor in the First World War. It's a time of economic disaster in the Confederacy, which is basically becomes equivalent to Germany now.
Right.
I don't think that equivalence was really there in the Great War series, but in American Empire, Harry Turtledove makes it very clear that the Confederate States has become basically the Germany of our world.
Both with like the breakdown of democracy and also with the hyperinflation, like the Confederate dollar goes to like $1 trillion for a coffee cup and stuff like that.
Yeah, and he captures well. So there's a lot of that. There's a Great Depression in 1929. But there's some other stuff too, and it's interesting how he fleshes out sort of people's lives, and there's some trends that sort of match what we see in reality, and some other stuff. Like probably the biggest thing is the development. So the character Jake Featherston, he's the artillery character, the Confederate artillery character in the Great War series, and he's turning into Hitler.
He's Hitler, basically. Like he happens upon this tiny little soapbox. This guy is talking about like, we need to restore the position our country has in the world and stuff. And he's stumping for this thing called the Freedom Party. The Freedom Party's maybe a dozen guys at this point.
And the guy's name is Anthony Dresser, which is an interesting reference because a man named Anton Drexler was the founder of the Nazi Party. Oh. So another sort of parallel. But yeah, so Featherston becomes involved in this, and it just sort of grows, and it becomes very, very clear that he's Hitler.
So, like, the success of the Freedom Party contingent a lot about the economic hardships of the time. Like, as things get worse and worse in the Confederacy, people are more dissatisfied with their lives. They turn more to, like, this radical fascist ideology.
Oh, it is fascist.
It's a fascist party,
And the thing is that they become very popular very quickly, and there's an election in 1925 in the Confederacy, or 1923 maybe. I think maybe 1923. But like in a very short period of time, they almost win the election. They come really close, and then some deranged member of the party assassinates the elected president.
Yeah, the Whig president, Wade Hampton V.
Yeah, Wade Hampton V. Yeah. And then they sort of go into the political wilderness, and then he uses radio to start building them back up again.
That's right. He meets this man, Saul Goldman, who's this like radio station operator, and he gives him some time on his station. And like Featherston's like the first guy who really understands the effectiveness of using the media.
Yeah, he uses the radio.
Yeah, which the Nazis did a lot of too. Like the Nazis innovated like mass mailing people stuff, like mailing people pamphlets and stuff.
I don't know that.
Like other parties never even did stuff like that. There's also like breaking up a lot of party rallies and stuff, going to other people's rallies and beating them up. Which was definitely a thing that happened in Weimar, Germany as well.
Yeah, well, and so the path roughly parallels, but like they come so close in 1923 to winning an election in the books, but in the reality, the Nazi Party sort of was building up its strength throughout the 20s. It never didn't have the ups and downs that the Freedom Party does in this, but it's a rough equivalent. And then obviously, you know, because there's a Great Depression happens in 1929, and then Featherston gets elected president, in I think 1933, and then consolidates control of the Confederacy. He gets rid of the Confederate Supreme Court, and he gets rid of his political rivals, and it's just sort of Hitler in the 30s, rearming.
Yeah, the rearmament stuff, like he introduces this mass mechanization of agriculture when they're making all these factories for tractors and whatnot. This is stuff that can easily be changed over to tanks, to making barrels, as they call them.
So they have that. And so they have this buildup basically until 1941, where the very end of the last book is the beginning of World War II.
Yeah, he says like codename Blackbeard, and that's like where it ends.
Yeah.
Where like he hears artillery in the distance, and the trilogy is over.
Yeah, but so that's just the outline of the Confederacy. But they throw in interesting stuff in between. So like there's a Spanish Civil War style war that goes on in Mexico in this book, and that's where a lot of Confederates go to fight to get experience. And one of the characters even is there for a little while.
Yeah, Pinkard goes down there.
Mm-hmm.
He's like a hardcore Freedom Party guy now. Mm-hmm. After the war, he comes across them, and his life is so crappy now. His wife leaves him, he loses his job, things are bad, so this party becomes his life.
And so you have that, and then you have in the North, you have the socialists win in 1920.
Sinclair, right?
Yeah, Upton Sinclair, the guy who wrote The Jungle, the very famous muckraking book in our history, becomes president. He beats Teddy Roosevelt, tries to run for a third term. And
one of my favorite parts of this whole series is when they're talking about the whole third term thing. They're like, well, traditionally it's only 2 terms because of George Washington, but George Washington was a filthy Virginian, so maybe we shouldn't care what he did.
Custer shows up in this, which is so interesting.
Yeah.
He becomes military governor of Canada. And that's a big deal because he wants to get revenge on the Canadians because his brother, Tom, was killed in How Few Remain fighting against the Canadians.
That's right. Right.
And then he's just sort of being pompous ass. And then he gets into, there's a really interesting scene involving him and another character.
Yeah. Arthur McGregor, who was like the vigilante from the last book, decides that he's going to go after Custer. Like Custer's the big head honcho, a symbol of American arrogance, and he's going to take him down. So they like have some Wile E. Coyote style antics trying to.
Yeah, well, Custer's in a car driving in a parade or something, and McGregor pulls out a bomb and throws it at Custer, and Custer catches it and then throws it right back at him, and the bomb like detonates at his feet and just like blows him away.
He throws it like a linebacker, just like with perfect form.
Perfect form. It was just very bizarre because Custer's like 80 like at this point, and he just all of a sudden just turns into like this major league pitcher just out of nowhere, and it was very strange.
Well, he was ready for him because like
Custer, I think he says like he notices someone suspicious in the crowd or something like that. It's been a while since I read this book.
It's like Custer is both a complete moron and also a genius. Like he's totally ridiculous and makes all these terrible mistakes and gets all these people dead. But also, he somehow knows McGregor is the guy who's going to try to kill him. So he like sees a photograph of him and he's ready for him.
I mean, you've got stuff like that. And then you have just portrayals of regular life. And then you have people whose lives are not as exciting, who just in the Confederacy and in the North. And they just sort of are living out their lives.
Like, Lucien, like... I like Lucien. I like
Gaultier. He's the guy in Quebec.
Yeah, he's like this Quebec farmer who has part of his land confiscated during the Great War, and it gets turned into a field hospital. And his chapters are... Nothing of importance happens in Lucien's chapters. Oh, the only thing really even vaguely important is that it gives some setup to how Quebec is its own independent country separate from America.
Yeah, well, I think Turtledove was trying to do that because I think so many of these characters are at the very center of the action. And I think that's his way of sort of saying, well, let's step back. Nothing of importance is happening on this guy's farm to the overall world, but let's get an idea for what life is like for a normal person. Because even some of the other characters will sometimes stumble into an important situation, but Lucien is never in an important situation. But that's okay because it gives an idea for what sort of the many millions, what life is like for people who aren't in the thick of it.
Exactly. It kind of introduces you to like the novelty of the radio and the birth of car culture and horses becoming less important.
Yeah, he trades in his horse and gets a Chevrolet, but he buys it because it's got a French name, right?
That's right. It's like, I want to buy a car, but I don't want any Ford. Like, I want something a little bit more Franco, He doesn't trade his horse in, though. He keeps his horse and he feeds it. He just never rides it or uses it again. Because Boy, he sure does talk to that horse a lot through these books. Like, I think maybe a combined maybe 30 pages of dialogue with his horse throughout all the 6 books he's in or something.
Oh, goodness. And then you have people like Chester Martin, who was a soldier and infantryman in the First World War, and then he goes to Ohio, and there's a really great scene in Blood and Iron where he sees like a strike being broken up, steelworker strike, because he's a steelworker, and he talks about how they use Pinkertons to like break it up. But then he says all the steelworkers are veterans of the war, so they all repel the Pinkertons because they have more experience fighting than they do. So like they organize and beat the crap out of these Union break. But then he eventually moves out to California. And he starts a new job, and he's showing how, like, the U.S., some people are starting to move out of the old cities in the East and trying to settle out, out west.
He meets our favorite Mordecai Three Finger Brown. He comes up again. In California.
He's his boss. He's Chester's boss in California. He's like a construction foreman.
It's a pretty minor character, but it's nice that he comes back. Even though
why. Harry makes a very, he's talking about, oh, it's Mordecai, and this guy has 3 fingers. It's like, Harry,
hey, aha. Yeah, you did it again.
It's back. Good.
There's also this guy, Reggie Bartlett, who was one of the infantrymen during the Great War. He kind of becomes like a voice of
reason.
The voice of reason in the Confederacy.
Like an anti-war sort of, man so horrified by the war.
Right, yeah. He's a radical liberal. That's the name of the irrelevant third party in the Confederacy. Only like a few places in Sonora and stuff ever.
Louisiana. They mentioned Louisiana.
That's right. Huey Long is a radical liberal.
Yeah. Louisiana, Sonora, and Chihuahua are the only strongholds. But then Reggie Bartlett, the interesting thing about it is he becomes a radical liberal activist, and then he gets straight up murdered. Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
in I think the 2nd book. He's in Richmond in a rally, and some Freedom Party guy like shoots him or stabs him just out of nowhere in public because he's organizing for the other party. And it shows sort of the death of decency, I guess, in a way you could say in the Confederacy, the consolidation of political power.
Because from that point on, like most people in the Confederacy are either villains or they're good people who just don't really speak up and don't want to put their neck out. To get hurt.
We do have one incident where Clarence Potter, so I don't know if we talked a lot about him in the first podcast, but he's this intelligence officer who went to school at Yale, but he's a Confederate. He's like sort of the voice of reason. Like he won't speak up. He won't be politically active, but he, in his inner monologues, he's talking about how terrible the Freedom Party is.
Yeah, he's a hardcore Whig.
Exactly. And he tries to go actually assassinate Featherston at one point.
At the Olympics.
He brings a pistol.
It's another parallel thing, like the Berlin Olympics.
It's the Richmond Olympics in 1936. And he's about to shoot him. And then it turns out black man who's selling like hot dogs there pulls a submachine gun out of his stand and just starts shooting at people trying to kill Featherston. And this guy, out of his own self-protection, shoots this other assassin, and he becomes like a hero because he saved the president. But like it's made very clear that Featherston realizes this guy was here to kill me, because they had interacted a lot during the war. So stuff like that. And so he peppers in stuff like that. And then there's what else? Oh, there's a war, actually. There's a minor war between the U.S. and Japan, between the Japanese. They bomb Los Angeles out of nowhere.
While Hosea Blackford is there, who is the president at the time. See, Hosea Blackford is the husband of Flora. Used to be Flora Hamburger. Now it's Flora Blackford. And he becomes president after Upton Sinclair because he was vice president during that administration. And he's the president during the Depression, so he kind of takes all the blame for the Depression, kind of the way that Hoover has taken a lot of the blame for the Depression, even though...
They even have their equivalent of Hoovervilles. They're called Blackfordburgs.
Blackfordburgs, yeah. And the Confederacy have their own version, but
Mitchelltowns.
Mitchelltowns, that's it.
Burton Mitchell is the Confederate president, who I don't know if is a real person.
I haven't looked up every Confederate president, but I notice a lot of the Confederate presidents are real people. I've just never heard.
Or they have names of, like, what's his name? Think the president in the very end of the Great War, he's like Gabriel Semmes, and that's named after, his last name was Semmes as well. Maybe Ralph Semmes? I can't remember. He was the captain of the CSS Alabama, which is a famous Confederate ship.
You also told me about how the vice president of the Confederacy, once Jake Featherston becomes president, is Don Partridge, you said?
Donald Partridge, yeah. Which is a good joke. That's a joke on Dan Quayle. Partridge Quayle. And he's also a doofus. He also is kind of like an intellectual lightweight.
Yeah. Which we'll talk about in a episode later about settling accounts.
Yeah. We'll get more into that. But it's interesting to see this sort of development. And in the North, too, it's just sort of, you have people all over. And he does a lot more snapshots of normal daily life. And that's good and it's bad, too. I wonder if, like, sometimes it feels like it drags a little bit. And you wonder if you need, like, a conflict that helps propel the narrative.
Yeah, I really like this series a lot. But I will say that around this time, I kind of got the feeling that maybe Turtledove gets paid by the pound when he's writing these books. I like them a lot, but I feel like sometimes maybe he can get to the point a little faster. Though I will say something about this trilogy is that things move so quickly compared to the Great War. Like in the Great War, only
1914 to 1917.
Yeah, it's only a couple years, whereas in Settling Accounts, it's decades.
Yeah, well, you covered 24, 25 years.
Like, I think in the first book, Nellie gets married, has a kid, and then the kid grows up to be able to speak by the end of the first book of 3. So, like, things are moving so quickly. I really appreciate that. I like that a lot.
Well, yeah, and he has to move it along quicker because he's got 3 books to cover.
Exactly.
Many multitudes, greater time. So, and then also because you don't need to know every single detail of these people's lives, although sometimes he can really dally on some of them. But you have interesting side things like Sylvia Enos or Enos. I forget.
I actually really liked in the Great War when she was a factory worker and stuff. Because I've done factory work myself. So the descriptions of getting to your station and working and then it feeling maybe 5 minutes have passed, but it's actually 8 hours. Like, I know exactly what Harry's talking about there. But yeah, Sylvia during the interwar time.
Well, first of all, so it was Roger Kimball, who's the Confederate submarine captain in the Great War, who sinks a ship that her husband's on. It's sort of like a war crime. She finds out about it because he talks about it publicly, and she goes down to the Confederacy and just murders him straight up, just shoots him dead.
It's great.
I forget where it was. Does she barge into his hotel room or something?
Okay, this is actually the point where Roger Kimball and Ann Colleton kind of break up. Like, Ann Colleton's like, I'm done with the Freedom Party. You guys are losers. I'm going to go back to the Whigs. Bad things happen between them. She storms out. He's kind of walking out to go down to Freedom Party headquarters to clear his mind. And, hey, who are you, lady? Oh no. Pop, 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 pop. Dead.
And then she also hangs out with Ernest Hemingway.
Ernest Hemingway, yeah.
Yeah, before he kills her and himself.
So in the book, he's only called Ernie.
Yeah, but it's clearly Ernest Hemingway because he ghost writes books for Sylvia and does other stuff.
He was an ambulance driver in Quebec.
Yeah, which is clearly Hemingway.
His problem is the same problem as a character in one of his books. The Sun Also Rises. There's a guy who has the exact same issue he does.
And he was severely injured in the war.
Yeah, he was severely injured.
And that causes a lot of problems for him.
It causes a lot of problems for him. That's correct.
Very bizarre.
Yeah, it's super weird.
Yeah, he kind of got it. That's the only unfortunate thing is that I think Turtledove's a great writer. I love that he did this series. I mean, this is, I think, the series that really got me interested in alternate history back in the day. But unfortunately, and you see it some in the Great War, that he can get off on these tangents. But he has to kind of rein it in the Great War because you've got this narrative, this whole war driving it forward. But I think that's the only unfortunate thing in the American Empire series is at times the tangents can get really crazy because he's got a whole lot open world to work with.
Which is interesting. Sometimes you get Ronald Reagan showing up on the radio, and sometimes you get murder suicide. So hey,
it kind of goes all over the place. But I mean, I guess he's trying to reflect that people's lives take different paths, and the war is sort of always hanging over people. How much this has devastated the land and the people and their psyche. Turtledove really covers a wide span, but you still have people in the military too. Not many. You have Sam Karsten.
Yeah.
He's on the USS Remembrance, the first aircraft carrier. He spends a lot of time complaining about the sun, which he does.
Yeah, Matt, I don't know if you know this, but Sam Karsten, he gets sunburned. So he has to put on zinc oxide, okay? But even then, it doesn't work all the time. And hey, get this, all right? When he goes to places like, let's say, Washington State or Ireland, he loves it because the sun doesn't shine so much.
That's a point that is made in like every single time that guy shows up in the books.
Literally, I think maybe 50 times. 50 times throughout all these books, that exact same spiel is trotted out. It's crazy.
Yeah. But they do interesting stuff with that character. So like they go to there's like all of Ireland becomes the Republic of Ireland. It's not, Northern Ireland isn't a cutout. And there's an uprising in Ulster by the Protestants. And like the U.S. goes and uses the aircraft carrier to help put it down and stuff like that, which is interesting. And then also in Europe, you have developments that are kind of paralleling. You have these fascist governments popping up in like France and Britain and stuff.
Yeah. France has this movement called Action Française, which I looked it up, was a real
very
thing.
real. Yeah, it was a real.
Oswald Mosley becomes a big guy.
He's the head of the Silver Shirts, I guess.
Silver Shirts. Like, I guess just because there's no Mussolini, so no black shirts, so it has to be a different color.
I guess so, but it has to be close enough for people to guess it. Yeah, but then in France, the guy who is the head of that organization becomes king.
That's right.
He becomes King Charles the 11th, which is really crazy because I don't think that was the point of that organization. But I guess he can get away with it here because it's a different world.
Right.
The Tsar is still in Russia.
They
talk about Stalin in it. The man of iron or the man of steel, and the hammer, which is Molotov. They have their last stand in Tsaritsyn, which is Volgograd today, which was Stalingrad.
Oh,
so
that's great. Harry, I love it when you do that.
Yeah, he's got these great references like that.
Japan's friggin' gigantic because they purchased the Philippines.
No, they captured the Philippines.
Did they?
They reference it in a previous book. In 1905, there's a war between them and Spain, and they just conquer like Guam and the Philippines. And all that.
Okay, well, I guess they purchased the Dutch East Indies and French Indochina. So they're massive. They're huge now. They're gigantic, and a lot of like their war goals in World War II are already fulfilled at this point. So they're
minor players.
They're minor players, but they're the guys in Asia more.
Well, yeah, I guess they're a major power, but they're minor players in the book. There's not a whole lot of.
Well, there is the war, but the war between the United States and Japan in the trilogy is like a pretty small skirmishes.
Yeah, there's naval skirmishes and stuff, and it doesn't hold up. There's interesting stuff too, like they have Calvin Coolidge. Shows up, so and he runs against Blackford in 1928, and Blackford beats him, but Coolidge is like, the stock market can't stay up like this forever, and Blackford's like, whatever, like that's just sour grapes. And then the stock market collapses. Coolidge gets elected in 1932, and then he dies before he gets sworn into office because in this world they haven't had an amendment to move up the inauguration. Because I don't know if people probably learned about this in history class but forgot, but up until FDR changed this with a constitutional amendment, presidents were sworn in on March 4th. So the lame duck presidency extended way farther than it does now. And they moved it up to January 20th. And then in the book, they have a compromise in the U.S. They move it up to February 1st.
And
Herbert Hoover becomes president.
Hoover. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that so much. That's so great.
And he's the one who takes over in the Depression. He doesn't do a whole lot of.
He doesn't do a whole lot. That's true. He doesn't like take the reins and fix everything. Unfortunately.
But then you have and some people have interesting ends. Like Teddy Roosevelt. He and Custer die about the same time, but they both get buried at Arlington, and that like sets off like a big deal in the Confederacy because it's not a cemetery in this world. It's just they're like, we want to be buried at Robert E. Lee's house.
Why? Who knows? But
I don't know.
Well, I think it's because Theodore Roosevelt dies first. He dies while golfing, I think.
Yeah, and
he gets buried there, and then Custer, not to be outdone, wants to be buried right next to him. So that's great.
Yeah, there's interesting. Pershing shows up. He gets assassinated in this book in Utah.
Yeah. He's in, I think, Salt Lake City, and he's standing in front of a window saying, we're about to give power back to the people of Utah, but I think this military occupation should continue. I think things are going to boil over here really quick, and they get shot in the chest immediately after he says that by a sniper.
And then one of the characters, Abner Dowling, takes over and he becomes like the military governor.
Yeah, Abner Dowling, he's an interesting character. He was in the Great War books as well as like an adjutant to Custer.
Yeah, and now he's like going off on his own career.
Here's something kind of interesting. Mark Twain's daughter from How Few Remain.
That's right, Ophelia Clemens. Yeah, she shows up.
I think she's with Custer the first time McGregor tries to murder him. But yeah, Ophelia Clemens, she's like this reporter or whatever, kind of carrying on the legacy of her dad, who in this world is like a big journalist.
Trying to think what else there is too. If other famous people show up, Oliver Wendell Holmes is the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, which is interesting because a lot of people think he was in reality, but he wasn't. He was just an associate justice. But here he's the Chief Justice, and he's like one of the last living like Civil War veterans.
So, something I like is the fact that there's a Remembrance Day parade, I think the first year after the war is over, and John Philip Sousa is still around.
Nice.
I love it. Do you know he's Portuguese?
Yeah, Sousa, yeah.
I had no idea.
But then also they have other cool stuff like they have the Statue of Remembrance in New York instead of
Yes.
the Statue of Liberty. It's like Lady Liberty, except holding up a huge sword and shield. And I think she's got like an angry face. So obviously the French didn't give that to the Americans, but man.
She should have like a tablet that just says "Go away." Right?
Oh, it's interesting. They eat peppers and stuff like that, and you can almost miss it if you're like not reading the book closely enough. You're like, oh wait, what?
Yeah, exactly. Like if you're just like, this is boring, and you're just skimming it, you're not going to get these juicy details.
Al Smith becomes president of the United States.
That's right.
1936.
The Happy Warrior.
The Happy Warrior, Al Smith. Yeah,
and the first Catholic president as well in this world.
And Franklin Roosevelt showing up.
Something about that assassination that we mentioned of Wade Hampton V. That's kind of interesting that we go until the 1920s before the first presidential assassination happens, because Lincoln doesn't get assassinated,
No,
obviously.
he's a character in How Few Remains.
Right, yeah.
Everyone hates him. Everyone, because he also, since he's so tall and weird looking, everyone's like, oh, Lincoln.
Nah, that guy. But like Lincoln's not assassinated. Garfield isn't president.
McKinley. I don't even know if McKinley is. They mention like at some point in one of the books, it may have been in the Great War books, that they mentioned that Alfred Thayer Mahan was president of the United States.
Who?
Alfred Thayer Mahan was a very famous. He wrote The Effect of Sea Power on History, I believe is what the book is called. This is from memory. I mean, obviously, go look it up if you want. But it's like the influential book that set naval policies for the first half of the 20th century until the aircraft carrier. Like he was the guy who came up with the ideas of like the decisive battle with the battleship. Some people say that he had the effect on Britain in Germany to sort of have that naval race before World War I, was that people were reading Alfred Thayer Mahan.
And then during World War I, like the hesitancy to actually get into battles with one another, because you're just like very afraid that there's going to be like this giant apocalyptic naval battle and one will win and the other will be.
Well, that's the whole idea behind like the Battle of Jutland was this sort of, and Tsushima was this like the idea of this like Alfred Thayer Mahan style mighty showdown. It's the naval battle that's going to be effective. So so they talk about that.
Apparently Robert E. Lee was president, I think.
Of the Confederacy? Yeah, I guess.
I believe they mentioned that, yeah. I like how the Confederacy has 6-year terms and there's only one term.
Until Featherston changes that.
He changes a lot. He changes the Constitution, because apparently in the Confederate Constitution you're not allowed to dam a river, which is what a horrible idea.
I'm not really sure.
Why would you do that?
Where that came from. But he uses that as a way to kick out the Confederate Supreme Court. And it's interesting, in that book, the Chief Justice of the Confederate Supreme Court is James McReynolds. And James McReynolds was famous for the fact that he hated Louis Brandeis. He was a big anti-Semite, hated Louis Brandeis. Wouldn't be in pictures with him on the Supreme Court. And he's the head of the Confederate Supreme Court. And then Jake Featherston just literally like shows up one day. He's like, you don't have a job anymore. Like we don't need the court anymore. Speaking
of the Supreme Court, Hugo Black is the vice presidential nominee for the Whigs in the final election before Featherston's elected. He almost gets shot in the face because people storm his rally and start shooting everyone. Another important thing, I love how Harry stays true to his principles. He continues talking about licking all the time in this trilogy. All the time. It's like, oh, those Yankees licked us, but we're going to lick them back one day. With this tank, we'll be able to lick them real good. That kind of stuff.
That's funny.
Good stuff. Thank you.
Also, funny things too that he throws in, like they make sense when he mentions them, but he talks about it in one book how like the Confederacy has their film industry, but it's in Florida.
That's right.
California, because it's warm in Florida. So I thought it was just very interesting that he thinks about like, well, where are things relocating and what are we thinking about this? And
well, like back in the 1920s and 1930s, there was a film industry in Florida. It kind of fell off when Hollywood became much bigger, but there's a lot of silent films that were filmed down in Florida. Yeah.
I think one of the great things about this series too is that some of these characters change radically over these 3 books, or have changed radically since the Great War. And that's the one advantage. Yes, this is a massive series. I mean, 11 books is a lot of books to read, but does give him an advantage, which is he can have characters change and develop and grow, but it doesn't seem rushed or forced.
Yeah.
Like these people change, but I guess it's sort of like the advantage of a TV series over a movie is like you can have character change over a gradual, more natural pace than all of a sudden like some guy's great and then he turns into like a psychopath the next time you see him. But it's overall, I think he does a great job with this series, and it has such a different tenor than Settling Accounts, The Great War, and How Few Remain, and that makes it unique and interesting. But also, if you really like the fighting parts, like there isn't a whole lot.
Well, I do like the fighting parts, but I finished Settling Accounts just a couple days ago. Mm-hmm. It is fatiguing with all this constant fighting, constantly killing each other. Mm-hmm. Like, I actually, to be perfectly honest with you, I think American Empire is my favorite series out of all of them. Oh. Like, I think there's a lot of really cool stuff buried in there.
The Ingalls brothers, we forgot to mention that.
The Ingalls brothers, yes.
Yeah, so Chester Martin is at a vaudeville show, and they talk about how it's the Ingalls brothers, which is really funny. But they talk about how they wear like big, weird, multicolored wigs and
beards. They have false beards.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
See, the Ingalls brothers are kind of a takeoff on
the Marx Brothers.
The Marx Brothers and Three Stooges, and those kinds of comedy acts of the era. And they all wear these false beards of different colors, and they're described as all having different personalities. So it's like it's like Groucho and Harpo and stuff like that. They talk about how there's this very proper lady who they're throwing oranges around and stuff. And you can see that in movies like Horse Feathers and
Duck Soup.
Duck Soup, yeah, exactly.
But it's interesting, Chester Martin comments, he said, oh, by the way they move, they're clearly veterans who fought in the trenches.
Nice.
Which I thought was interesting, which shows, again, how World War I had a big impact on the U.S., in reality, for many reasons. But it's magnified in this world because chunks of the war were fought in the United States. The losses were much heavier in a country with a smaller population. So, the war, I think for many people in the interwar period in the United States, World War I had an impact, but it wasn't the way that Europe was impacted, that whole generations of, men were lost. Whereas this is a United States and a Confederacy that is very much feeling that loss in a way that the U.S. didn't really feel until the Second World War in reality. And I think it's an interesting reflection. I think Turtledove does a good job of capturing that and sort of making it clear that this is a society that has been scarred.
By the time of Settling Accounts, everything is related to the war. Even back in the Great War, there were still people who were kind of untouched by it, like Ann Colleton. But by the time of Settling Accounts, the war has come home completely. Everything is about war. War is totally inseparable from the American experience at that point. And the seeds of that are kind of set up in American Empire.
But he also, in another thing too, is he does his very, very interesting approach of killing off a lot of characters too.
Yeah.
So tons of the characters from the Great War series do not make it.
Well, it's like 20 years between the first American Empire book and the last one. So, I mean, these
But most of them don't die like natural deaths. Well, Lucien Galtier does.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert.
Well,
but then,
it's natural. It's a natural process.
A natural process, but it's not. I mean, but one character like cuts their hand and then uses them to like... Okay, I'm not... Sorry, I don't want to laugh, but it's ridiculous. It's like this book is very serious sometimes, and then a character cuts their hand while cooking with some raw chicken, and then they die of blood poisoning. It's just like out of nowhere. But it's not even like in one of the segments they cut their hand, and then later on, like they're like, oh, this doesn't look good, I don't feel well, and they die. It's like they cut their hand, and then they don't feel well, and then they're just dead.
In the course of the single chapter, yeah.
It's like very just... I mean, it's just odd.
Well, maybe Turtledove's just trying to show like a world before good antibiotics. Like this kind of stuff would happen. Mm-hmm. People would get an infection and just die. Ronald Reagan showing up is pretty darn funny.
Dutch, yeah.
Cincinnatus is sitting in his bathtub and he's listening to the wireless. They call radios wireless in this series. He's listening to a football game and the announcer is Ronald Reagan. And it's Turtledove on point with this. Like Ronald Reagan at one point says, and there he goes again. And Cincinnatus is like, wow, he's so great. He's such a great communicator. Just... Yes! Harry, you're so good. Thank you so much.
Clarence Darrow shows up.
Speaking of Cincinnatus at one point gets unlawfully imprisoned while he's in Kentucky by the Kentucky State Police. And
Clarence Darrow just like comes out of like nowhere. He's just like, ta-da, I'm here.
He's summoned from the netherworld.
He's like, let him go. And he's like, oh, okay. No, but so they have... But it's cool to see the development, and it's cool to see these characters sort of come into their own because they do become more fleshed out as they experience the world. Also, they mentioned that Prohibition is still in effect in some states.
There's still dry states all over the place.
Yeah, Iowa. That's something that Cincinnatus brings up multiple times, is that his neighbor brews home-brewed beer. And he's like, oh, I'm really glad that I got to have some beer with my food because Iowa is a dry state.
Well, it's the same thing with Jefferson Pinkard, because in the Great War books, he talks about how his neighbor makes beer and how they drink beer together and stuff. And in Alabama, I believe he's
I think it's in Birmingham.
So I guess maybe like if Turtledove does more books into the future, there'll be like a Prohibition movement in the 1950s or 60s. What?
I don't know.
What's going on?
I don't know. But he captures it overall well. It's a great world, and he's a great world builder, and he does a good job here. He builds an interesting...
I've never really read anything like this. Never even remotely like this. Something so long and so sprawling with so many great little details calling back to older books. Like, it's really cool. I really like this a lot.
I wish someone would maybe make this into I know we mentioned it last time, but a series.
Seriously.
God, you could either do a long-ranging series in which you can cover more of the interwar period. I feel like if HBO or someone was going to do that, they'd probably make like a mini series out of the Great War, simply because the war that just has more action to compel it.
Exactly, yeah. But I mean, like all those shows, Game of Thrones and whatnot, they seem like they're almost designed so that you can kind of stretch that stuff out a lot. And this is a series where you can stretch events immensely. You can either condense things or stretch them out, like have an entire season where Hosea Blackford is president or something like that, and the season finale is him losing or whatever. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, but it's a great series. I think it's well appreciated in the alternate history community, but I think more people should read it because it shows like when alternate history is written well, like how great it really can be.
Yeah.
And how much people talk about licking.
And licking. I think Harry really
wants to get that point across.
Represents licking well in this book. Everyone's just, I licked that guy and that guy licked me, but really, in the end, you were licking yourself the whole time. I think that's the message.
Very enjoyable. Very enjoyable.
Yeah, well, I think we've covered everything in this book series.
So, hey, send us an email, talkernatehistory@gmail.com. If you ever want to suggest an episode topic, we'd love to hear from you guys. We're trying to figure out more topics. So,
or just, give us some feedback, whatever.
Yeah, whatever you want.
Yeah.
Well, this is Matt signing off.
And this is Max signing off.
See you later, guys.